Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the October FERC Professionals Group. My name is Drew Franklin, and I am the head of marketing here at H-Data. We are so excited that you took some time out of your busy schedule. I know that there's a lot going on. It's getting close to the end of the year, and we're excited to be able to have a special guest with us. But just kind of key reminder, we're going to have an opportunity to really hear from Emily Mallen, and she's going to be able to present on the top takeaways from the FERC's recent open commission meeting. And I think you'll get a lot of insights and a lot of wisdom coming from this event going forward. So let me go ahead and we'll jump into this. Just give everyone just a brief breakdown of what today's program looks like. We'll just do a quick welcome, and I'll introduce Emily here in just a second. I wanted to give a brief overview of a free low lift opportunity and a tool we have on our website called the Energy Scorecard. We'll run through that here in a little bit, and then we'll run straight into our programming. We'll have some time there at the end of the presentation for a Q&A or open discussion. And we've got some nice flexible times because what we've noticed over the past several months is the Q&A spills into some really healthy either debate or further discussions, and it's always a good time to have some opportunity to have that conversation there. So again, I just want to welcome everyone for coming back. This is something that we reignited this group back in June of this year, and we've just had incredible speakers come join us from former CIOs at large investor-owned utilities to former FERC chairman, and we are very, very excited to have one of what I think is someone outside of our two former FERC chairmen who sit on our advisory board, probably the next most excited person about FERC regulatory data and the legal aspect of FERC regulatory. And so a little bit about the FERC Professionals Group. The purpose of our group is to create a community of FERC reporting professionals interested in solutions for producing and consuming that financial and operational data. And this is a place that we believe in, that creating just a nice opportunity for you to network and to meet other peers within the industry. We've just noticed that time and time again, just creating this place has extended relationships within the industry, but also being able to share insights, tips, and being able to have that information just freely available for the group. Just as a quick reminder, feel free to join us if you're on LinkedIn. Join our community group there just by searching FERC Professionals Group, and we'll make sure and get you added. We're adding folks every week, it feels like. We went to the Liquid Energy Pipeline Association meeting last month out in San Diego, and talked with a handful of customers from Energy Transfer and a few other folks from Colonial Pipeline, and they were just making mention on how they've had some interesting conversations come from being part of the FERC Professionals Group, where they were able to connect with people that they may or may not have been able to connect with otherwise. And it was really nice to see, and we appreciate that. And that's one big thing that the LinkedIn group is there for, is to get feedback. And we hope that we'll be able to have that nice feedback loop coming from our LinkedIn group. So go ahead and join us there if you're on LinkedIn, and we would love to continue the conversation there. I mentioned earlier about energy scorecards, and what about scorecards, and why is that important? So part of our platform in the H-Data Explorer through our business intelligence tool, so we know that you're needing to submit those quarterly reports, and then how do you then take action on all of that data that's taken place? We know that the FERC has implemented really a digital transformation movement. They're utilizing XBRL, that machine readable format that's built within the forms now. And then through our platform, we're able to digest all that information from 11 plus years of FERC data. And then we can create some very unique, whether it's peer group analysis, benchmarking. You can also do several other financial analysis based off those. And we have three made reports that are freely available by going to our website and clicking on the Energy Scorecard tab. And you can go in and you can customize and being able to plug and play with those reports. It's just a low lift opportunity for you to be able to see how that data is extracted and be able to visualize it in a meaningful way. And that's just one offering that we would love to share with you, and just wanted to make light of that here on this call. Without further ado, I would love to introduce Emily Mallen. She's a energy regulatory attorney and partner at Sidley Austin, she's based in Washington, D.C., and she is a proud graduate of the Washington University in St. Louis, and also received um, her law degree from Duke University School of Law. So go Blue Devils! And you'll find Emily counseling clients in natural gas, oil, and products pipeline industries, really with that federal regulatory and transactional matters. And one big thing that she's helping her clients understand and comply with their obligations under the energy and environmental laws, with particular focus on the Natural Gas Act, Natural Gas Policy Act, the Interstate Commerce Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act. And she's been able to provide be that strategic voice for dozens of gas pipeline companies. And I had the privilege of meeting Emily at the Energy Infrastructure Council Investors Conference in May of this year. And like I mentioned earlier, I haven't really met someone outside of our two former FERC chairmen that get really excited about FERC and FERC data. And without further ado, I want to bring up Emily and welcome her to the FERC Professionals Group. Emily, glad to have you today.
Thank you, Drew. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I think what I heard you say is that I'm a real nerd.
No, not
I
at
get
all.
really
You get
excited
excited about
FERC.
what we love. So I think you fit
Well,
right in.
my husband thinks I'm a real nerd, but my kids think I'm cool for now. Until they get older, they'll realize the errors of their ways. But thank you again for that introduction and for inviting me today. I know you can see me, I can't see you, so I don't know who, and you being the audience, I don't know who's in the audience with us today. I do know based on H Data's offerings that it's not just oil and gas sector, which is where I focus, but also the electric sector. And so hopefully there'll be some learning today because I'm going to focus on the oil and gas sector for those folks who are primarily focused on Federal Power Act type reporting.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then I guess I'll give a shout out to LinkedIn, the importance of LinkedIn. I put a post up on LinkedIn last week, just kind of musing what I thought might be interesting, what might come out of the October meeting and what would be interesting. And Drew's like, hey, you want to turn that into a webinar? I was like, okay, sure, why not? Can't hurt. Because actually what I liked about the challenge of turning my musings into a webinar was it really forced me to focus on thinking thematically about, what is the agency doing and how is that going to impact my clients? Because I'm always interested in kind of looking around the corner and looking at what's next. And what was, I think, kind of cool about the October meeting, because we had the winter energy and energy market and reliability assessment report, is it was kind of an overview of the themes that I saw coming out of the other orders, which had to do with, how natural gas has really taken such a prominent role in electric markets and the pricing of electricity, and also how FERC has really become, not, I won't say all of a sudden, but certainly with the war in Ukraine, like an international trade agency with the importance of LNG and the role that it plays really as a gatekeeper for the LNG markets by authorizing these terminals, and the number of terminals now either under construction in the United States or with proceedings pending before FERC. And we really saw that tension come up with the different orders that were at the FERC today. So Drew, if you can advance to the next slide. Well, it's fine. I had an agenda slide where I was just going to kind of put out what I wanted to focus on, which was the winter energy market reliability assessment, the policy change for oil pipeline index rates, the numerous decisions implicating LNG projects, including decisions that were on the agenda but actually ended up issuing prior to the meeting. And then the number of Natural Gas Act Section 7 certificate orders that were also issued last week. Sorry, to think about where we were. Um, Thank you, Drew. And again, I want to focus on the oil and gas matters because that's my area of expertise. But I also, well, I put this presentation together. I want to be responsive to those of you out there. If you have questions and you want to start engaging in discussion earlier, I'm more than happy to kind of step back and stop, because this is just a platform for me to talk, but I'm also here to listen and really have a dialogue with everyone. So I guess moving on to what I took away from the reliability assessment is that, thinking about what is FERC's role in the energy industry. Is it's both, in my mind, like hugely significant and hugely insignificant. It's hugely insignificant because it doesn't actually regulate the commodities that allow us to power our cars or power our homes. What it does do is it regulates the market conditions that make the use of those commodities possible. And sometimes all of its market tools that it has are kind of useless to when you have things happening internationally outside of FERC's purview that are actually affecting our prices and our access to energy, right? So I guess it was almost very humbling in a way to think about this as an agency that sees itself as hugely important, but also an agency that maybe doesn't have as much of an impact as maybe the chairman sees itself having. And this also comes out with the role that the agency plays as a regulator of climate change, and whether it's a regulator of climate change and how it considers climate change. And that also came out a lot in this meeting when I think about where the agency started the year in January and where it ended towards the end of the year now in October. Because in January, even though Chairman Glick has been chairman since the beginning of the Biden administration, there wasn't a Democratic majority of commissioners until this year. And so I think some of those pent up policies that would impact greenhouse gas emissions, environmental justice, the things that I know the chairman cares a lot about and really wanted to make a difference with, he couldn't really do what he wanted to do until the beginning of the year. When he had a Democratic majority. And then we've seen, I think, the gradual rollback of where FERC started the year. And it kind of came to a head in my mind with this meeting and with this energy market reliability assessment, just as an overall thematic thing, because what did we learn from this assessment, right? So we learned that for an energy rich country with a ton of natural resources and with the most competitive gas market in the world, we're still kind of crossing our fingers that we have a mild winter. We're kind of just like, okay, yeah, we've got all of this great stuff to keep the lights on. We're not dependent necessarily on, foreign adversaries to supply us with our energy. And yet, the good thing we have going for us is that it's going to be hopefully a mild winter based on projections from scientists. And what I had put in my LinkedIn post was, is the winter projection going to be as dire as the summer projection? And I think the only difference being in that in the summer, you tend to have more natural disasters, hurricanes, fires, and floods. Those are more of a summer event than a winter event. Now, of course, in the winter, you can have extreme weather. Certainly Texas knows that, and Boston knows that you can have extreme weather in the winter. And that's really what's driving the prices, is that we have, even though we've got supply outpacing demand a little bit, based on this report, we've got, lower inventories in storage, and we have a huge increase in demand for the export of LNG. So the fact that we just have fewer reserves for our domestic market means that the futures prices are higher. And so, and they are substantially higher than they were last year. And there's this real concern that energy is just becoming more unaffordable. And then this is where, FERC could actually play a role as the market regulator. And what's the market regulator going to do to have an impact on energy prices? And Drew, if you want to kind of go on to the next slide. What did I come up with my takeaways? What struck me about this meeting is some of the basic fundamentals haven't changed. And I looked back at some of the reliability assessments for the past 5 years. And one thing that really struck is that this assessment was twice as long, almost 50 pages long. The others were around 20 pages long. There was so much emphasis on the war in Ukraine, and on LNG. And it really is this focus on international events, which in the past have not played as big of a role on how we price electricity in the United States. We have the oil markets have always been internationally priced, but the gas markets have not really, I think, until this year. And there's probably folks on this call who are smarter than me when it comes to pricing. So I don't want to make too many blanket statements here, but the fact that we've got Boston now competing with Europe for LNG versus Asia, which is something that had been in the mix for a while now, really goes to show that the agency can't just be looking inward. And I think at the beginning of the year, when we were so focused on what are we going to do to disincentivize fossil fuel development because of climate change, which is, I think, the position the chairman was taking. When you don't necessarily have to worry about other geopolitical events, maybe that's something that you can tackle as an agency. But when suddenly you've got geopolitical events that are impacting domestic prices, maybe there's other ways the agency needs to be thinking. And it looks like the graphic got a little bit screwed up here when this was converted from converted to PDF. But I had this, what are the tools? What is the toolbox? Because at the meeting, Commissioner Clements raised this point. Well, maybe we don't have the tools that we need to have to address some of these issues when it comes to higher prices and concerns about reliability. And, depending on who you ask, there's very binary reasons why we have this reliability concern. Commissioner Christie, which I don't think is wrong, noted that here we're seeing what happens once you retire baseload generation, and it's very easy to retire. It's very hard to bring new generation into its place. And suddenly we've got not as much coal generation as we used to have. Gas needs to be the new baseload generation. And do we have the infrastructure in place to keep us at a steady state? So if you talk to Danley, the issue is always about certification, whether or not we're certificating pipelines as quickly as we need to, with the least amount of red tape as we need to. And then rate making. Well, how much can the agency do with its rate making function to have an impact on the energy markets? I mean, you have Chairman Glick saying, well, maybe New England shouldn't be it's really not okay for New England to be this reliant on LNG. But what is the alternative, and what is the market design that the FERC can do to encourage them to bring in other resources? Because certainly we know the story when it comes to building pipelines into New England. It's a non-starter. So, what role does FERC have there? And then the enforcement piece is the other big tool in the toolbox. There was a decision by the Fifth Circuit just last week that really maybe limits what FERC's enforcement authority is under the Natural Gas Act when it comes to market manipulation. So there's a lot of stuff in flux right now. And I think, what I took away from this meeting is that right now, when it comes to the gas markets and to fossil fuels, FERC really is focused on LNG. That's the big story is LNG, and the big story is the generation of power from natural gas. And that shows up in the certificate orders later in my discussion. So I'm going to move on. I don't want to talk forever. Go on to my next thought, which was focused on this new policy statement. And maybe I'll pause and see if there are any questions from anyone. I don't know.
Yeah, we've got one question that came in, Emily, and it's for those of us who work with data from FERC forms. Are there any key numbers in the gas pipeline reports on Form 2 or Form 3Q that might help us track reliability over the past 5 years? And then I guess second part of that question is it hard because pipeline operation is too small a piece of the gas energy industry?
That's a good question, Hudson, and I think it's something that I want to take offline and think about a little bit more. I mean, what I always look at on a Form 2 is whether or not the cost of service is going up or is going down, and depreciation, and this actually will come into play when we talk about the index and the issues with the index, which is the next slide. So maybe it's a good launch pad into that next point, which is that companies are spending a lot of money to maintain reliable systems. And to operate efficiently. And we're seeing, we've had PHMSA, which is, for those of you who don't live in my acronym land, the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, finalized their gas mega rule this year, which is going to put a lot of pressure on pipelines to do more to modernize their systems, to be investing more in their systems, and all of the money that's invested goes into these forms. And you want to make sure that you're spending the right amount of money, but you also need to be making sure you're not spending so much money that you're under recovering your costs. And that's where these forms are helpful for folks trying to make sure that rates are staying just and reasonable. So whether there's specific things to look for, I'll have to take a look at the forms and give you a specific answer. But overall, that I'm always interested in is how much are you spending on your cost of service? How much are you spending to operate your system? What does your O&M look like versus your capital expenditures? And how does that line up with the markets that you're serving? So for those of you who mine data, there's probably a lot in there that you can look for. Those are the things I look for.
No, that validates a few conversations we had earlier this month with a few different oil and gas executives in Houston, and they said the exact same thing with O&M and cost of service, and like those were some of those KPIs that they're kind of tracking pretty heavily to kind of match that. So thanks for sharing that, Emily.
Oh, sure. And that kind of goes into the very issue with the index, because the index is totally driven by form data. And what we saw, and this is where the evolution of the agency from January to October, I was so surprised, honestly, by the tone of the oil pipeline index order that came out on Thursday last week, because it said we're going to make it harder to file a complaint against a pipeline to the extent that they have this test. I guess I should back up, because I know that I'm starting to get into jargon for folks. So if you're an oil pipeline, there was an act of Congress passed in the 90s when a lot of these markets were revised, that wanted to make it easier to change rates for oil pipelines because the process was becoming so litigious. And they came up with this method. The FERC came up with this method called an index, which allows pipelines to raise their rates collectively as a group based on the producer price index for finished goods. And so it's an inflation-based index, essentially, that allows pipelines to recover additional costs on an annual basis. If the index goes up, you're allowed to raise your rates by that indexed amount. If it goes down, you will have to lower your rates. But you don't have to raise your rates, and it's very hard to challenge an index rate increase. But at the same time, it's very hard for a pipeline to get a cost of service rate. They have to go through hoops to show to FERC why they're not recovering under the index and why they need a cost of service rate, something that's going to take more time for the agency to consider, and it's going to be more litigious. At the same time, they're saying, shippers, if you're going to challenge a rate, it's going to be harder for you to challenge an index rate. And that's essentially what happened with this change. And this is another example where the commission is very much responsive to the courts of appeals, and especially the DC Circuit. And the DC Circuit didn't like how they were looking at a protest of an index and how they screened protests of an index differently from a complaint about an index rate change. So there was an NOI that came out, notice of inquiry that came out a couple of years ago, where FERC basically implemented this year against a lot of opposition by the shipper groups who didn't want this test to go into effect, this new test, which is a 10% threshold test, which essentially says that that if you, sorry, here I am trying to look at my notes, means that if the protest, there has to be more than a 10 percentage point differential between the index rate increase and the change in the prior 2 years cost of service data in order to, that's the initial screen in order to get a complaint before the commission. And when I say I was surprised is that in January of this year, the commission changed course on the index, and essentially at the end of the Trump administration issued an order that said that the index could go up by a certain level, and this is for a 5-year period. And then there's this 5-year macro level index that's set, and then it changes each year based on inflation. And when there was a change in power at the commission rolled back that change on rehearing and actually turned it from a positive number into a negative number, and made all the pipelines file new rates that were reduced. But there was a lot of discussion in the order and also at the meeting about windfalls by the pipeline companies and protecting the consumer, which is interesting because the Interstate Commerce Act is not a consumer protection statute. And the consumers being protected were, the oil producers, not or the airlines or the folks those are the typical shippers on an oil pipeline. It wasn't, the widows and orphans that we sometimes think about when we think about gas pipeline shippers. So anyway, I expected it to not be so easy on the pipeline industry. I thought the order was going to be a little bit harsher, or maybe take more of a stance that was in line with what the shippers wanted, which was either a lower threshold that wasn't 10%, or to not just or to give them more wiggle room to challenge pipeline rates. So again, I thought macro level takeaways for what happened here is that the commission is recognizing there's a lot of market volatility, and pipeline rates and how the index is set is based on addressing that market volatility and giving some wiggle room so that you can spend money to make sure your system is reliable. You can spend money to make sure that you're operating efficiently. And then if you are operating efficiently, you're rewarded by getting a little bit extra cash on those years where you don't need to put as much into operating your system. So I really felt like the FERC was coming back around and really defending its indexing methodology and showing that there's other ways to set rates that aren't just cost of service rates that they're going to stand behind. And again, this was a very different tone than what we saw earlier this year. So it was, kind of an interesting outcome there. But again, the index, for those of you who are involved in the HData community, the index is probably the most important part of the Form 6. And Drew, is the Form 6 one of the data points that you all track? Mm-hmm. And yeah, so this is your time to shine.
Yeah, that's great. No, that's awesome.
All right. So the next and then the next item that was really heavy for oil and gas was the LNG decisions that either issued during the meeting or a few days prior to the meeting. So that's the next slide, Drew.
There we go.
Thanks. And there were 4 orders. 2 of them came out either Thursday or Friday of the week prior, and then 2 of them came out. Golden Pass and Lime Tree Bay were both issued at the meeting, or the day of the meeting, and Golden Pass I'll talk more about in the next. It's more of a certificate issue than it is an LNG issue, although it's related because it's a feed gas pipeline to support an export terminal. But it just it's kind of striking to me that there were 4 decisions on the agenda that all have some very close tie-in to LNG, and really goes to show, I think, the real profile of LNG is really exploding. Oh, wait, that's not a word I should use. Sorry, not exploding. LNG is not exploding. It's not. LNG is an area that is taking up a lot more of the commission's time than it has been. And I know that maybe I'm late to the party there, because obviously there have been a number of authorization orders under Section 3, and this is not a new thing, but it felt different to me in the context of the war in Ukraine and in the context of the reliability assessment that also came out at this meeting. Especially, Lime Tree Bay, this was a declaratory order where there's a terminal facility, there's a port facility in the Caribbean in St. Croix that receives all sorts of goods, and they wanted to make sure that they wouldn't be subject to FERC jurisdiction if LNG tankers use these facilities to offload, to transfer LNG between their two ships. And it was smart for them to do the petition for declaratory order, because we know with the new Fortress Energy case in Puerto Rico, the company did not seek a declaratory order for FERC because they had, for good reasons, made assumptions that they were not FERC jurisdictional. And then FERC found that they were in a show cause order, and that was upheld by the Court of Appeals. So, it wasn't surprising that they went for this declaratory order, but it was another example of the FERC delineating where it has jurisdiction and where it does not, which is good for the industry trying to figure out what sandbox they need to be in. So, it wasn't an order that really, I won't say it didn't make new precedent. I mean, it did make new precedent to the extent that it really clarified when FERC is going to assert jurisdiction over a terminal and when it's not going to assert jurisdiction. And it didn't hold this to be a terminal facility because it's a port that has all sorts of goods. It's not just being constructed for the import of or the export of LNG. So they said, we don't have jurisdiction on the Natural Gas Act. The Rio Grande LNG and the Corpus Christi liquefaction case, those came out before the meeting, but they were on the agenda initially. And both of those were extension of time proceedings. One is a rehearing and one is an initial order denying a request for extension. Denying opposition to an extension of time, where a lot of these facilities have asked for extensions of time to construct their facilities. They've used COVID as one of the reasons why they need more time to construct. And we've had a lot of the environmental NGOs opposing them on grounds that, no, it's just market conditions. And that's why they haven't built them. And market conditions are not good cause. So FERC, you shouldn't allow them to have these extensions of time. And by the way, you should also make sure that you reevaluate whether or not we need these facilities at all. And this is a newer tact by the Sierra Club and other environmental groups trying to challenge these extensions of time. And there were two orders where FERC said, no, thank you. Extensions of time, that's in our wheelhouse. That's with our discretion. And we've got a lot of discretion here, and we're going to go ahead and grant those. So again, it is just another marker of supporting, I think, LNG development. I thought the Corpus Christi liquefaction rehearing order was very supported, and it needs to be, because these issues are actually now in the DC Circuit. And then the Golden Pass pipeline, that was a proceeding where the pipeline company is going to be feeding an export project and is really changing its gas supply. And it's moving from some larger interstate pipeline companies, and it's going to now interconnect with Enable, Gulf Run, and an interstate pipeline in Texas. So they needed to change their certificate order to change the design of the project. So that was there. And I guess, this, again, the takeaways here for the next slide, Drew, is that, there's just, FERC is really part of a global marketplace now. And I think it needs to think about itself that way. And the interplay between the global markets and the domestic markets is set, especially when it comes to LNG. Yeah. So should I pause for any other questions or move on?
So I'll remind everyone on the call, please feel free to share questions in the chat area. Curious, Emily, I just got back from a WEC event, the Western Electricity Coordination Group, and a lot of it was on security and reliability. Mm-hmm. Curious to see, you mentioned earlier about FERC's presence on maybe their lack of control or their lack of enforcement that kind of came out of your takeaways within this commission meeting. But I know there's been a lot of, whether it's opinion pieces or things I've seen in the news with the struggle for interconnections, and curious to see if any of those takeaways from the October meeting gave you signal, or you saw where that was either being a priority or there was some action being taken there for better interconnections for a reliability standpoint.
Yeah, and all of that goes to the electric power and the bulk electric power system. And I focused more on the orders that were issued under either the Natural Gas Act or the Interstate Commerce Act. Yeah. I didn't focus on the Federal Power Act. Obviously, FERC has a number of outstanding rulemakings right now to try to solve for that problem. But I guess I would say that the gas markets in many ways inform what the commission could or should or shouldn't do when it comes to electric reliability, because they are so competitive. And when competition works and when it doesn't. And competition works really well, I think, in the US when you're only competing domestically. And we're seeing with the gas markets with competition is now if you're competing with international markets who have a different set of a whole different scheme, a whole different regulatory scheme. Like if you're competing now with a whole other countries for your energy, do we want to have the same kind of competition in the United States to protect consumers, or now do we need more of like a command control structure to protect consumers, something that's more top down? If competition's not going to lead to the lowest price, if someone is willing to pay a much higher, an external factor is going to mess with that market and pay a much higher price. So I think that's what's really interesting, what's happening with competition in the gas market right now. Obviously, electric market would be different. We're not building undersea cables to transmit electricity to Europe. But I think the whole market concepts could be applied to electricity. And the issue, of course, with electricity is how do you store it, and how do you save it for later? And that, that is what makes it so tricky when you have competition
Right.
on the electric markets, because you don't have like a storage inventory for it. We're
Well,
working on
then, well, then it gets back to maybe those the distributed energy, like the storage piece of that, where you've got General Motors who just came out with like whether it's the home or the large commercial storage
that.
items
Yeah,
there. When you're talking about, yeah, we're able to transport LNG or natural gas elements across the great big lake, but what if, I mean, 5, 10 years from now, we're able to have a proper storage system for electricity?
yeah,
Then that becomes an interesting case study for this globalization market we're kind of heading into for energy, and how that impacts domestic competition, to your point.
yeah, absolutely. There's many disruptive ways that we're gonna.
Yeah.
I mean, we're just so in this. If there's a waterfall effect in terms of the energy transition, like we are over the barrel now, and we just
Yeah.
don't know what's going to happen.
No, that's
There's
great.
so many opportunities for disruption of the markets right now and how
That's
we do
awesome.
things. I mean, it's awesome. It's terrifying. I don't know, but it's it's interesting. It certainly keeps it interesting. Certainly keeps
Oh,
it
for sure.
interesting.
Well, and I think that one thing that was mentioned, I've heard this mentioned in a few different. I know Chairman Chatterjee mentioned this, but also Becky Blaylock, former CIO at Southern Company, how technology. I mean, even 20, 30 years ago, how technology has advanced, whether it's competition or access. And I think that we're still on the forefront of how technology is being able to, whether it's spread access or create this new way of distribution, whether that's on the electricity side or the oil and gas pipeline side.
Yeah, I mean, on the pipeline side, it's the commodity costs what it costs often, and then the transport piece is whether or not you can effectively get it from point A to point B. And if you can't get it from point A to point B, you're going to see the value of that commodity go down a lot. And that's what we saw with the Freeport LNG. What happened there? You had a huge amount of demand destruction where suddenly you couldn't get the molecules to the
Mm.
market, and so the value of the molecules goes down. And that's always a problem when you've got massive piece of infrastructure. I was just listening to a podcast this week that I thought was super interesting. It was an interview with this man. I think Peter Aramenko might be his last name. He's the founder of this company called Universal Hydrogen. And what he wants to do is because it's very hard to build pipelines to transport hydrogen across the country. Let's treat it like freight. Let's turn it into a fuel cell, package it in a box, and then you can ship it on a street or on an airplane or somewhere, so that you can get these hydrogen fuel cells to. And he wants to use them for airplanes. And I was like, this is amazing. This is going to put me out of business as a pipeline lawyer, but it sounds like a fascinating value proposition. And I think, yeah, we're just going to see a whole lot of disruptive technologies, especially with the Inflation Reduction Act unleashing a lot of money. So yeah, so I may or may not have a job in 5 years.
But
We'll
it
see.
sounds like we have another topic to do a deep dive in, that you can have your own practice then uh, on the
Maybe.
technology disruption side. So we'll see.
Yeah, and so maybe just to close this out before we open it up for more of a discussion, my last takeaway had to do with how FERC is treating Section 7 certificate orders. And this is under the Natural Gas Act, Section 7. You can't put a shovel in the ground and construct any pipeline, interstate pipeline facilities, or operate them without a certificate from FERC. And so there were 3 orders that concerned Section 7. One is the Tennessee order was not the initial certificate order. It was rehearing, but you've got it for all 3 very long-term contracts, and it's either LNG or it's going to gas as a source for electrification. I mean, certainly with the Texas gas project, where the gas is going to be feeding natural gas turbines for an electric generator, and even for Tennessee, which is to serve a state-regulated public utility, and whether or not that's going straight to consumers, that gas, but it's still going to this idea, I think, of more electrification and how are we going to generate that electricity, and we're generating a lot from gas, or it's going to LNG, and that's where this is happening. And then sort of the next slide, where we talk about sort of what the takeaways are from these orders, because we had at the beginning of the year this very disruptive way of regulating certificate orders with this policy statement that FERC put out and then pulled back very quickly when it came to what was going to constitute the public interest under Section 7 of the Gas Act. So the basic no subsidy threshold of their 1999 policy statement was at play here. We saw a lot of discussion about rolled-in rate making and how we adjudicate whether or not what kind of rates we're going to charge for these new projects. The 2 main differences that keep popping up, of course, are environmental justice and greenhouse gas emissions. And I think we're seeing a lot of, there's not a whole lot of daylight between the commissioners, maybe some with Danley, when it comes to FERC's role as environmental justice as an input to NEPA versus greenhouse gas emissions. But it's really striking when you compare the initial Golden Pass certificate order, which was in 2016. There's like 0 mention of environmental justice. There's a couple footnotes saying, yeah, the EPA mentioned it. We referenced that in our NEPA document, versus 13 and a half pages on the impacts of environmental justice in this most recent order. And part of that is FERC being responsive to the DC Circuit, and part of it is that FERC has made this its mission to make environmental justice a really big part of its considerations in these certificate orders. And then with climate change and with greenhouse gas emissions, the next issue is, is FERC the proper entity to determine what constitutes significance for emissions, and what does that look like? And there's a real divide there between the chairman and the former chairman, and I think a couple commissioners who just don't want to get into the fray. So I feel like I've been talking for a long time. I think I'll again pause, take questions, and look forward to the discussion with everyone on the line today.
Absolutely. That's great. Yeah. And again, feel free to add questions in the comment section. With like your last point on addressing significance, is there, I guess, in your opinion or what you've noticed, another agency that would be a better fit there, or is FERC the right agency or the right voice to help address some of that?
Oh, well, no, FERC is not, in my opinion. Well, I mean, the industry will often point to EPA.
Yeah.
EPA regulates air emissions, and how can we determine what's significant if we don't have a common baseline, if we're not using the same inputs, if we're not using the same data set? And so that's always been the struggle. And certainly even with the social cost of carbon, which is something that a lot of the environmental groups are pushing FERC to use as a metric to determine whether or not there is a significance when it comes to emissions. And the whole reason why, for folks who aren't aware, the whole reason why that you would consider significance, this goes to NEPA, and whether or not you're going to have the federal action is going to have a significant impact on the environment. And that's what FERC and every agency that's subject to NEPA is directed to consider when it's issuing any sort of permit or authorization that's going to allow an entity to move forward with project. So even with the social cost of carbon, what you price the discount rate at is going to hugely change what the impact is from a dollar value. So we can't get our story straight in terms of what is the right measurement to use. And I think everyone's very afraid that if we use the wrong thing, we're going to, I mean, Danley talks about it as like pulling numbers out of thin air, essentially, and it all being
Mm-hmm.
very arbitrary. And then how do you defend against something that's arbitrary before Court of Appeals? So it's a very messy subject, but I think there's a lot of discussion about, well, EPA is the right regulator, and this is not the same thing as a significance determination when it comes to wetlands or when it comes to noise impacts or when it comes to other types of resources that FERC will consider in its NEPA review of a project.
It's good. You mentioned earlier, as as we're waiting for a few other questions possibly to come in, I was curious on, you mentioned, you listen to a podcast. What are those resources, those go-to knowledge places or community groups, whatever you may have, that you're able to stay on top of a lot of this conversation that's happening outside of being there in person or being in tune with
Well,
directly with the agency?
I mean, that's where commuting and sitting in traffic really comes in handy, right? Is podcasts. And you're like, what am I going to listen to? I'm not listening to the news. Then I'll jump off a cliff. But sometimes podcasts aren't any better. Well, actually, that podcast was a very commercial one. That was how I built this with Guy
Hmm.
Raz, which is an NPR program. And I like to listen to How I Built This, and because it's a conversation with entrepreneurs. And I sometimes like to fashion myself as having an entrepreneurial mindset, but I don't, because I'm a lawyer and I'm super risk averse. Um, I mean, honestly, where I go to for a lot of my information is probably similar to a lot of folks here. I mean, I read a lot of the law rags like Law 360 and E&E and Platts. And I try to, I read a lot of trade press, and I try
Mhm.
to synthesize themes across the different platforms and see what are people really focused on. But I also like to read the really technical journals like the Gas and Oil Journal, which is
Mhm.
mostly for engineers, and kind of
Yeah.
understand what are the engineering challenges that the companies are facing. Stuff that lawyers don't typically look at, honestly.
Yeah. Or like the American Oil and Gas Reporter is another great one. They always
Yeah.
have some nice themes each month, whether it's right at the wellhead or the technology that's going in to track everything. Um, it's great. I appreciate you sharing those resources. Um,
Mhm.
it looks like we're see somebody trying to type something, but
No pressure. If you guys just want to go eat lunch, I won't be offended.
no, that's great. I am definitely curious. Getting back to, I guess, to Hudson's question on whether it's the Form 2 or Form 3, or even you mentioned Form 6 earlier. Um, Outside of like cost of service and O&M, what are some of those, like from an oil and gas pipeline perspective? Like if you're advising a client, what would you say? Like, hey, here's like the top 3, top 5 KPIs to where we can really get some valuable data if we're wanting to monitor something.
I mean, when FERC gets involved is always on rate of return and
Yep.
trying to figure out what is that magical rate of return that you can earn and fly under the radar, and not find yourself in some sort of enforcement proceeding with FERC. So
Mm-hmm.
as a rates lawyer, that's the number one thing I think we're always thinking about, because that's what it comes down to, when the agency gets involved, and how easy is it is to extricate that data from these forms. Uh, Most of the time, though, I see numbers and I get a little bit scared, and I freak out. I'm a words person, not a numbers person, but honestly, I read a lot of numbers every day also. So I, I
Mm-hmm.
did I did bad running away from numbers by coming into this field.
That's okay. Um, well, we can go ahead and, as we're working on, I think what you said, yeah, we may be getting a little bit of, everybody's getting that blood sugar low. That's going to be okay. Well, Emily, I do want to just say thank you. Thank you for sharing. I mean, your takeaways, like you said, I saw that on LinkedIn. I was like, that is like gold material for our group. And we're so excited to have you come share your knowledge and kind of your expertise from the FERC Commission meeting that happened this past month. And definitely be on the lookout for more conversations. I think what we talked about earlier, the technology piece would be super interesting, and how hydrogen has become this top of mind conversation from an energy perspective. So maybe that'll be a conversation in the future.
Absolutely. And again, thank you very much. And thank you to everyone out there who listened to me. And I hope to chat with you. I guess if you do have questions that are, super pressing, you thought, wow, I didn't think to ask that. Certainly, I think my contact information is with Drew, and I'm happy if anyone wants to send me an email, I'm happy to chat with you offline.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I'll make sure to share Emily's contact with just within our FERC Professionals Group, that kind of smaller list, and also the attendees that were here today. I'll take one last note on this piece before we step out. Just as a reminder, if you are trying to figure out an easy way to locate the 10 plus years of FERC form, whether that's 1, 2, 6, the annuals, the quarterlies, we have an easy way to do that through our H data library system. And I may or may know someone who has already have access to that that's on this phone call. But it's a free way for you to sign up, and you have immediate access to all of those FERC data. It's just a quick way where you can have those at your fingertips. I just wanted to share a quick reminder that we're actually in the process, and this is where like kind of the insider news comes from this group, is we're going to be working on a new feature within the library, and we're excited about potentially being able to share that over the next couple of months with some nice advanced search features. And so that hopefully will be able to help drive a little bit more easy search of use, because we know that eLibrary, yes, it's a tool, it's a great tool that's there, but this is just another easy access point to be able to find all of that information. And just we'll wrap this up by just saying thank you. Thanks to Emily for sharing with us. Thank you for your time, and thank you for all those who have joined us today. And be on the lookout in November. We will have another FERC Professionals Group, and we will have that information shared with you very, very soon. And I hope you all have a wonderful day and a wonderful rest of the week. Thanks again.
Thank you.